obviously the Teesside Procurement Consortium aren't present during this meeting. We're going to be looking at the portal where the tender's registered. I've had a quick look through the attendees, and I'm obviously very conscious. I think quite a few of you will be very experienced, but we do have to take account of anyone that's maybe doing this for the first time, or, you know, even in a larger organisation that is experienced. It's maybe somebody that's been given the responsibility to track this tender and to get it completed. So my plan is to do some initial presentations on slides, and then we'll swap over and we'll actually look at the live tenders. So the good news is, obviously, because it's been published, we can actually go through the each individual part. As Fran says, obviously, we're not really here to ask questions on the content, particularly, or terms and conditions, that kind of thing. I think, however, Fran, I think we can still encourage people to put questions through the chat, and we can certainly pass those on, and those would be shared in the normal manner by the Teesside Procurement Consortium. So there will be, these slides will be available. So as soon as we finish the presentation, you'll be able to log on. I think there's a brief survey and you can get access to the slides as well. So don't worry about taking any notes at this point. But what I'm trying to do in the slides is really highlight the most important elements of getting in, getting the documents, maybe a few tips as well. I've talked about completing your response. Intend, we've been established now for, it's actually nearly 14 years. And a lot of what we do almost day to day is working with clients who are bidding for public sector contracts, and we're very aware of the challenges. Every tender is different, so you know, what's asked for in one tender you can't immediately use for another, and there's certainly elements in this tender that I'll try and point out as we go through, where you're going to have to be very aware of how that's put together. So anyone that's brand new, hopefully I'm not going too fast. I think Fran said you can stop if there's anything you're not clear with. Experienced bidders, if you can stay with us just for a little while, and then we'll get straight through to the online demo afterwards. The first thing to explain is that there are two systems in Scotland. I think many of you will know of this. Public Contract Scotland, PCS, is where the contract notices are advertised, and that's where you would first need to go in. So if there is anyone listening that maybe heard about this opportunity, no idea where to get started, this is where you go. So Public Contract Scotland, there's a tab you can see here to register. So you can do that very easily. And it's very basic information that you'll be asked for in the registration. There's just a couple of slides here, but as I say, there's nothing here that would prevent you getting on to PCS initially. And all you're doing at this stage is just trying to find the contract notice, which is more or less the advertisement, if you like. So my recommendation is, once, in fact, you don't really need to register for this part of it, but it's a good idea just to be registered anyway. If you're trying to find the contract from Teesside Procurement Consortium, my recommendation is, once you're on PCS, look for the Search Buyers tab, which is here at the top. It will bring you up with a screen. So in fact, I've put Teesside Consortium here. It's actually Teesside Procurement Consortium, but it will bring that up. Click on that, and that will bring you into what they call the buyer profile for really any public sector buyer. This was going to look exactly the same. You have a tab here called Current Contract Notices. If anyone's interested, by the way, and you're doing a bit of research, you can use this Search the Buyer to find future contract notices, awards. The contract register is a very good source of all the contracts in place currently. But if you do that, it'll bring up this link here. This little icon here with the small square in the arrow tells you that it's not actually going through PCS, it's going through the PCS tender system. Gives you the deadline, and be aware that sometimes what's in PCS might change slightly once you get onto the PCS tender portal, because that's more of a live system. Quite common, I would say now, for tender deadlines to be extended a little bit, perhaps. So yeah, just you might find some documents and be slightly alarmed that they've given a deadline that looks not quite what you're expecting. So in this case, we already know that the tender is being administered through what we call the PCS tender system. Again, it's a public system for the whole of the public sector in Scotland. And I think, again, most of you will be quite aware of it because it's used particularly for larger tenders now. So as soon as you see the contract notice coming up, I would recommend just before you do anything else and move on to PCS tender, it's a good idea to read the full notice text first. So this little tab here, that will give you the official overview, if you like, of the whole tender as it's been published. And I noticed a couple of things just going through the full notice text. One, it already gives you a list of all the lots, which is quite useful because it takes you a little while once you get into the other tender documents to find that. And there's something towards the bottom of the tender notice as well that relates to community benefits, which I think quite a few of you will be familiar with, but there's obviously some commitments to that, which again will be in the tender document somewhere, but it's quite good to have a heads up just to know. And I think at the moment they're saying that kicks in after £50,000 worth of contracts awarded, contract value, if you like. So read the full notice first. At that point, then you're ready to go on to the public PCS tender website. But in order to find the tender notice, you can search through the whole list, but it's much easier if you've got this project code. So the 21427, make a note of it, click on the PCS tender website, and that will take you through to the PCS tender portal. Now that is a completely separate system to Public Contract Scotland. So it's tended to be used for higher threshold tenders. But I have to say, in our experience, to be honest, we've seen, really quite small tenders run through PCST as opposed to Public Contract Scotland. And it sometimes is really just a preference of the buying authority, which one they want to go to. So the main issue is if you've not used PCS tender before, you need to get registered. So again, you have to do that separately. It's a very straightforward system. There's a little link here, register as supplier. Registration data is very straightforward. You get to choose your username. This is the one we would use. There's a little bit of information that you have to fill in, more tick the box, I would say, than anything else. You'll get sent a temporary password. You can log in and then you set your own password. Just as an aside, by the way, probably I think every 6 months PCS tender will ask you to change that. So if you're working in an organisation where you're all using the same password, it takes a little bit of management to make sure that everybody's got, the most up-to-date one, if possible. So you've got registered. You'll get through to PCS tender. So we're now at the stage where we're ready to try and find the contract. And there's a little bit of kind of jargon here. I think any of you that have been bidding for quite some while will recognise PQQs used to be the pre-qualification stage, which was a kind of what I would call the stage 1 of a tender, and some tenders are issued only at that point. ITT stands for invitation to tender, and that's the one that you want to click on for this opportunity. So when you do that, it's going to bring you into a space automatically called ITT's Open to All Suppliers. And this is where we're going to need that project code to try and filter through, because I haven't shown you the full page here, but effectively once you open up at this point, you could get 3 or 4 pages. You know, I've seen some that are literally at any point there might be over 100 opportunities open at any one time, and it could take you quite some time to search through. So there's a little drop down box here. You can choose project code, a drop down box for the operator, choose contains, and then type in your value and then click on search. And that will, if you're doing this for the first time, this will bring up the link here, and that's a live link. So you just click on that and it brings you into a page which has the full tender. It calls it here the master ITT list. There's a couple of options you can decide later. There's a printable view, which I have to say I find very useful, because that particularly if you're working with maybe subcontractors, or there's quite a few people in your team all needing to look at the documents, you don't necessarily want them all logging in on your account and working their way through the system. So that printable view gives you an overview of all the questions that you have to answer in total. It's quite a long PDF in terms of pages, but it's something quite useful just to circulate to your team to say, you know, here's what's been asked for. Already we can see the kind of shape of the tender. You need to express an interest and click here, and that's what's going to open up the tender documents. So I've called this slide PCST functions, and any tender that you're looking at in PCS tender will have a couple of tabs here. So the first tab, the ITT invitation to tender details, will open up and it will show you the settings. So that will give you the very latest deadline date, deadline for questions, which is very important, buyer attachments, which is absolutely essential. We're going to look at that shortly. My response, so the elements that you need to fill in. And there is an option here, associated users. You can add in other people within your organisation that can work alongside you on the tender. The other tab for messages, again, is very, very important, and it's most important probably at this stage while the tender's open. Those of you who've logged in already and registered will know that, because there's elements of Q&A coming through. And we'll have a wee look at that later, but it lets you obviously receive messages. So anyone that's asked a question, all bidders who've expressed an interest will get a copy, and anything you've asked will also be sent out to all the bidders. So you can see your sent messages, you can draft them, create them, and so on. So we'll look at this online, but I just wanted to highlight particularly the buyer attachments for this opportunity, in my opinion, are absolutely crucial. There's a little bit of a tendency, and I think we're probably as guilty as others in this, that you can sort of pile into the questionnaire and start answering things. But there's a huge amount of information in buyer attachments that you really need to download and read everything in total before you even start to complete any of the questionnaires. The bidder agreement is okay, it's for information, quite general. Conditions of contract, absolutely crucial. In this tender, you're being referred to standard industry conditions of contract that aren't attached to the documents here. So you will need to either own a copy of those or buy a copy or get access. And there is already what they call an additional terms of contract, which is a Word document, which is there. Evaluation and awarding criteria, again, I would almost put that probably top of my list once I've looked at the conditions of contract and you've done your bid, no bid decision if you want to bid for this. And we'll talk a little bit later about a couple of the documents there that are going to be crucial. Instructions for tenderers, again, essential, particularly this one because it's structured in quite an unusual way and you need to be referring back to quite a number of documents to be able to answer some of the technical questions, for example. Fran referred to the previous event, so there may be some of you listening in today that didn't get to that. So this is quite useful. It gives you the Q&A that came from that previous event that already gives you a little bit of a feel for what was coming through. Specification, absolutely essential. So it's a contract, it's got 16 lots, and this is the area, and I've seen, I think, a couple of questions that have come through already, and people saying which bits of the pricing do I need to fill in? You know, what are the requirements for this or that? Is such and such included in the requirements? And the specification documents are very explicit in terms of obviously what's required, but also which bits of the pricing spreadsheet you need to fill in. Supplier response guide is not from Tayside Procurement Consortium. That's a general guide, how to use PCST. And this final one, the technical pro forma, is very important. So again, I'll let you see what's in that, but that's a pro forma relating to one of the scored questions. You can do a mass download. You'll be glad to hear. I sometimes have problems when I mass download these into a project file because the file names are a bit long, so I sometimes have to store it in a My Documents and then copy it down. But it's much easier potentially than downloading everything bit by bit. But obviously there's a lot of reading in here. Whoever's involved in the bid, and that could be, obviously, you'll have bid writers possibly, but your senior management need to be involved at this stage as well to look at conditions of contract, maybe your legal people. So if you've not taken time to do that so far, this is really important. I've kind of picked out there, I think, the ones that I think are most important to look at. The instructions document, so there's a bit of an overview here. Again, hopefully most of you have got most of this already. So there's a value stated. It's for 3 years plus a 1-year extension, which is optional, 16 lots. Conditions of contract I've mentioned already, and they note that prices, it needs to be a fixed price for the first 3-year term. So that will be part of your strategy, clearly. And then looking at the weighting, obviously pricing is the most important at 80%. But if the pricing is all quite close for everyone, this 20% is really going to make a big deal difference. So you need to be looking at the technical questions to maximise your score. It's done in a fairly standard way. So for the scored questions, you'll get one of these 5 scores. To me, that's like a 0 and then 1 to 4, if you like. And if you look at the evaluation methodology, they'll give you a very clear definition of what constitutes a 50% compared to 75% answer, for example. This is a framework contract, so in many ways you'll be bidding for this if you're successful, and I think it says, I'm sorry I've not put this in the instructions, but it was in the contract notice. I think it said that they would have 40 suppliers across the 16 lots, so maybe not so many people per lot. Once you get on the framework, you may get no work at all, or you'll get work either through what we call a direct award. So if you fit the bill, so to speak, the buyer, and that would be any one of the 3 buyers mentioned above, can basically award you the work straight away. There'll be certain terms and conditions, obviously, maybe specific to the works. Or if it's a slightly larger piece of work, they may send that out to mini competition again. In the mini competition, this can work two ways. So whatever you end up with as your quality score, that 20% maximum, may carry on with you. So you don't need to add any more detail of quality, and it's price only. Or I've noticed in the tender documents, there is an opportunity if the buyer wants to reopen the quality scoring with some additional questions. So again, this is quite a common issue with frameworks, but it's good to read all the tender documents so you're absolutely aware, once you're on the framework, how that's actually going to work in practice. Also be prepared. We had a client a couple of weeks ago who was on a framework and didn't appear to be getting any work, and we checked the documents and it was what they called a rotational framework. So in theory, they should have got every second job of the two contractors, and that wasn't coming through. So they've challenged it. The work's coming through now, but they've lost a few months with the work not coming through. So make sure you know how this framework is going to work in practice once the award has happened. There's a couple of documents that need to be completed, signed and scanned and uploaded. And that's in the, I think they're in the qualification section. Evaluation guidance. This document talks about the qualification stage, what we call the single procurement document, and people might have recognised previously as a PQQ. It's not too demanding in my experience. So the buyer's got an option to choose which of these Part 4 questions they put in. But the crucial element here is you can actually be excluded from the tender at this stage if you don't pass this qualification stage. So suitability is just looking for company's house registration. There are insurance cover levels. All of them, you can say either you've got them or you commit, so shouldn't restrict anyone. But this financial ratios, I'm going to show you a slide shortly. There's quite a demanding list, I would say, to validate your financial stability, your financial state, if you like. There's an allowance made, and again, if you're a new business, for example, a new business startup or relatively new, take a look at the tender documents to see what you can provide in place of those. 4C1, I would say, is an area in my experience, again, where it's a pass-fail, but it's a place where you can actually be excluded if your project examples are read and the evaluators say, I'm sorry, not relevant, not quite matching what we're looking for. So I think there, and again, we'll have another slide, maybe talk a little bit in terms of tips on how to make sure that you maximize your chances in this area here, not to fail. Manpower, so we'll be looking basically at numbers of staff, number of management, and 4C10, it's a percentage value of the contract to be subcontracted. Now, if you're doing various lots, then there may be some lots where you won't. But there might be other lots, so you need to differentiate there as well. And then on the final section of qualification, there's no requirement for quality management or environmental policy in this one. All that's been asked for is the health and safety. So evidence of ISO 45001 or safety schemes and procurement, so CHAS, construction line, these types of things, or again, if you're a smaller business and don't have those, it's absolutely valid to give an account. And I think there's probably a few more questions that you would need to answer. But we certainly have quite a few clients who are quite large companies that don't, maybe less so in the health and safety, but certainly in some of the quality areas, they do have processes in place, and you can evidence that and still pass at this stage. And an important note, if you are using subcontractors, they will probably or almost certainly need to provide a version of this SPD, single procurement document, and there will be an attachment for them to do that. So that's the evaluation, guidance document. This is the evaluation methodology document. And I've just given you the kind of front page of this, but this tells you obviously which is scored, which is pass-fail. So obviously pass-fail potentially might be a wee bit subjective. I don't know if you'd sort of say, well, what constitutes a pass-fail in some of these, particularly this one here, section 6. Others are quite specific about actual plans, health and safety. There's going to be a number of questions in there. So if you don't get a 50% score in any of these questions, then it could be, it says it may result in you not getting through to the next stage of evaluation. So again, obviously, it's not good enough just to give a kind of skimpy answer. If you think, oh, well, I had a client ask us a wee while back, say, well, it's only 20%, we're dead busy, can we just put in whatever and rely on a really good price? But it's not, you could really get taken out of the whole process. If you do that, that's quite a major risk, I would say, not to get that minimum score. So just coming back to the tender system, we've looked a little bit, obviously, at the My Attachments. The buyer attachments, crucial. My response, and we'll look at this at the online demo in a bit more detail, 3 areas. Qualification, so that's the bit we've talked about just now, the supplier single procurement document. Technical response, there's quite a lot of questions there. I think this says missing mandatory, but I think there's about 26 questions. And commercial is where your pricing is going to come in, and all 3 of these need to be completed before you can clearly submit your proposal. The qualification side, again, I think we'll probably look at this in a wee bit more detail when we go online. But for those of you who are bidding regularly, I think you'll be quite familiar. Part 1 is the buyer information. Part 2, all about us as an organisation, but this is where you have anything to do with, the terminology here is horrible, I'm afraid, but they call it reliance on other entities. And also subcontractors, and you can have subcontractors that you rely on to meet what they call the selection criteria, or subcontractors that you don't. So it takes a bit of time to look at that part 2 and just make sure that you understand the relationship that you've got. Reliance on other entities tends to be that you have a subcontractor, and if they didn't do their bit, you wouldn't meet. I think there's a question that said, do you meet the specification in full, for example? That to me would be what I call a significant subcontractor. So you'd be looking to put in an SPD document for them as well. Part 3 can look quite horrendous if you're doing it for the first time, but that's a whole list of business probity questions, ranging from very serious offences, literally criminal offences that if you ticked yes, you wouldn't go any further. And there's what they call discretionary exclusions. So it might be that you've had maybe a health and safety prohibition notice, or I don't know, a tribunal, something like that for an employee issue. So something's happened. It's not great, but you can show that somehow your business has overcome that, so that it's discretionary in terms of the buyer can decide whether you're kind of in or out at that stage. The important one in this qualification response is this part 4. As I say, I think we've already showed you the slides on this one, so I'll not spend any more time on that just now. This is the financial ratios. Again, I'm not going to go into those in a great amount of detail, but I have to say we would tend to recommend that you pass all of this on to your accountant. If you're a bigger company, obviously that will be in-house. but a smaller company, just check with them, get them to come up with all the different information. And it's for the last 2 years that you have to provide it. Again, if you meet the requirements, there is an opportunity to put a bit of dialogue in. So I think in the text, you're allowed to explain, maybe particularly, quite a lot of it, maybe it's a little bit different this year, but certainly in previous years, people have been asked for the last 2 to 3 years, have you been in net profit? And of course, people have gone through COVID, loss of staff, literally a close down, furlough, so the financial figures were nowhere near what you would call the normal. So people were being asked for these ratios, but having to put in a sort of statement to confirm kind of where things were, how the order book was looking. So, okay, post-COVID, things are looking a bit more, positive, if you like. There's something here at the bottom that I've picked up. So you've got to ensure the suitability of subcontractors, including financial standing. So that might be a question that needs to go in if you're what I would call significant subcontractors also need to provide that. To me, that wasn't particularly clear. So example projects, when you get to this in the qualification, there's a little template. So you need to click on that, a very simple Word document. But you do need to be, this last bullet point is a pass-fail. So you really need to include a proper account, really. And I've seen some people put in, their 2 examples, and it's literally almost just like a 1 or 2 liner as a description, and that's not going to be enough. So bear in mind, you've got to do an example for each lot. So each one's got to be written in such a way that somebody reads it and go, oh yeah, this is a good example of this type of work, not a generic one that you've stuck in kind of for each of the lots. And I know if you've got 16 lots, that could be a bit challenging. You don't have to have a separate project for each one, but you do need to rewrite them a little bit. So again, based on experience, an area where people, you really could be failed potentially in this area before your technical stuff or even your pricing's looked at. So that's the qualification side. I've picked out a couple of things just on the technical questions, just to show in the slides. The format for most of the technical questions is as it appears here. So it just says, please provide requested information as detailed in the attachment. The attachment, if you've not used PCST, might not be very obvious, but it's this little triangle here, and if you double click on that, it'll open up the document, which you obviously save, fill in, and then you attach it and upload. The information on those attachments, so this technical 2, technical 1, technical 3, obviously all the different questions, that also appears in that evaluation document, so you can get the same information there too. But quite a challenging amount of technical information to provide, so I would sort of warn you in advance, don't be leaving this to last minute. And exactly the same principle applies to the project descriptions that we described earlier. So we'll talk a little bit just in another slide about hints and tips, but this is the one where if it's going to be scored, which you can see here, this one's got a percentage score against it, you absolutely need to plan your answers and make sure that you provide the most possible information, but it needs to refer back to the specification and the tender documents. So don't just cut and paste in something that you've used before. There's an attachment in the buyer attachments for the technical 6 question. So again, you might just, work your way down, think, oh, here's question 6. But in fact, question 6 is made up of, for each lot, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 separate responses are needed. So I would be looking at technical 6 probably today, if you haven't looked at it already, and make sure, because there might be slightly different questions. I've just had space here to do the first kind of 2, 3, 4, 5, but make sure that you download all these. It's a zip file, and pick off the ones that you're bidding for. Just a note, if here is a very good example. So for question 6, technical 6, you're going to end up with 5 different responses. When you come to upload it, you can only upload one file, so you need to submit it as a zip file. I've included some information, I think if I remember in the slides here, how to do that. So if you're a bit stuck, you can go back and refer to that. So tips for the technical questions. Again, I do know that quite a lot of you are very experienced, but I have to say we're doing work with companies, and some of them are actually global European companies bidding for really large tenders, but everybody struggles. And some of the tips for the technical questions apply regardless of your size, because it really is down to the team that's looking at it and how much care you're going to take to make sure that this is absolutely bang on for what the Tayside Procurement Consortium is looking for, not just a generic answer. So for any of the technical questions, there's obviously quite a few, I would suggest you plan your response. So don't just start filling in the text. There are some word limits. I'd be doing that as a team, maybe, at least a minimum of 2 people saying, what is it that we need to respond to here? Let's look at the spec. What is it we need to answer from there? Use the same terminology that's used in the spec and so on, but really put quite a bit of effort into your plan. And then the writing is much easier when you come to put that together. So cover all of the points. If there's any evaluation guidance for each question, for example. So go back to, I think I mentioned earlier, that 25%, 50%, and so on. I'd be looking back at that to say, well, a good question will give us this. An excellent question, we need to produce something slightly different. So just challenge yourself when you've written your answer and say, how would I score that? Does it really give us that 75 or 100% score? Obviously keep to any page limit, and I think I've noticed already for some of them, I think there's a 4-page limit, which to me seems very generous. I've had to do some terrible tenders where you have a massive big question, you have to answer it in 500 words or less. So just make sure you know, and again, all the documents that you've got in the buyer attachments will make that absolutely clear what those are. Don't cross-refer. So if there is an instance where you think you're maybe being asked the same thing again, you need to literally repeat the answer. Don't refer back to a previous response. And don't include web links. So those won't be, the evaluators either can't or won't follow those when they're looking at your bid. There are attached documents, and I think there's templates there. So just make sure that your company name's on all of those in case there's any doubt once that's fed through to the evaluators. The commercial section, I've obviously, this is something which is a bit more specific. We wouldn't normally deal with this. And clearly any questions you've got, I think I've seen already a few questions coming through about this, but there is something I've highlighted which is a little bit unusual. So there are 2 identical pricing spreadsheets. The first one asks you to allow in your pricing for payment of the Scottish living wage, £9.50 an hour. Obviously, I mean, that might be a question, for example, because that living wage will increase if you're pricing for 3 years fixed. But that's the one that will be scored in terms of evaluating all the different bidders for each of the lots. You are also provided an opportunity to put in the same pricing schedule based on your current rates that you would use. So that's not scored, but I'm guessing that's there for information. But that's something, again, which you need to have a quick look at if you haven't checked that already, and read through the instructions documents and the evaluation documents. Asking questions. Any public sector tender, once it's published, you can't phone up anyone. Everything will have to go through the portal. They will know who's asked the question, which I don't think is a big issue particularly. But when the question and answer goes out, you need to remember that it's visible to everyone. So as long as you don't mention your company name or making anything obvious in the text of your question, that would remain anonymised. So don't be frightened to ask questions. I think in every tender we've seen, and I've seen a couple on this one as well, where maybe something's not been uploaded or there's an error in a spreadsheet, for example. Seriously, don't wait for that. You know, you need to, as quickly as possible, make clear, particularly on the pricing side, that you're aware of everything. The deadline currently is 28th of June, so there's a little while left, obviously. But anything at all, as I say, I always say there's no stupid questions at this stage. The response formats in PCS tender are all pretty straightforward. So there's a yes or no or a drop-down list. There might be, I think I've seen a couple where you've got a character box to fill in, but more of them, I think, are this format of click to attach a file. I'm not going to go through the how to attach a file just now, because I think we should spend our time going through that, but that's on the files on this slide, rather, if you need to see that. So just before we move over to PCS tender, the system, the PCS tender portal, you have to keep saving your changes as you go. I think it's around about maybe 15 minutes or so if there's been no activity, and you might be just scrolling down looking at things, but unless you're actually adding something or changing something, if you don't have some sort of activity, it will, what we say, time out, and before you know it, you've got a blank screen saying you're back to the main page. So you might have added in a few things here and there, but then not done very much. If you don't save your changes, you'll lose all that work. So this appears at the top of your screen. So you need to just keep saving the changes as you go. Annoyingly, they've changed the system. So if you save your change, it takes you up to the top of the page again, whereas before it seemed to keep you where you were. And save and exit will take you out of whatever section you're in. So whether it's qualification, technical or commercial. The validate response while you're in a section is very useful because it will help you check on any what I would call mandatory questions. And those are the ones, if they've got this red asterisk, if you don't fill them in, the system literally won't let you submit once it comes up. So again, a good reason to check it well before the deadline. So submitting your tender, once you're back into this kind of my response summary area, the sort of main page, there is a little 3 dots here, which I mentioned right at the beginning of the slides, which gives you that printable view. And if you press it at this time, it's going to give you your printable view, but with all your answers included. So I think you can go back and do that after you've submitted. But it's quite a good idea to do it just before you submit, and then you've got a record of what's gone in. Otherwise, obviously, check all your documents. A word of advice, check on your uploaded documents. I've had a couple of occasions in the past years, really, since we've been using this system, where something's been uploaded and it's got corrupted. So it's showing as like 0 kilobytes. So just absolutely make sure that all the documents are correct. You can submit your response. That will go through, and it will tell you response last submitted on and give you the date. And if the deadline's not been reached, you can literally keep going back as many times as you want before the deadline, make minor changes, but at least you've got a response logged on the system. So I would recommend, obviously, put your deadline well before the main deadline, but remember that you can go back in, and on PCST, as opposed to PCS, this system is reasonably easy to review that. You've got technical support help. The phone number I find is really good, I have to say, particularly for PCS tender, but they won't help you with the content. It's all about whether the system's working. So I'm just going to stop sharing. So just checking the time, so it's 11:25. Obviously we've gone in quite a bit of detail already, so I don't need to do too much of that again, but it's really just to log in now and show you how the actual forms look and any of the sort of issues, just to highlight again. So clearly I'm registered, I'll sign in, ITTs. I don't need to go ITTs open to all suppliers because I've already registered, so it's going to be sitting in this area here. As you can see, I've got quite a lot of my ITTs on the go, but this is the one for Tayside Procurement Consortium. So response to be submitted, running, it gives me the deadline again too, just so I'm aware of when that is. And obviously once you're on the system, again, I think most of you who are familiar with the system, quite often you're clicking on things and boxes pop up. It's quite a busy screen, I would say, so it's not a fantastic user interface. But obviously once you start to use it a wee bit more often, it becomes a little bit more familiar. So before I go into ITT, I'll just click on this Messages tab that we talked about earlier. If I click on Receive Messages, so I've picked up on today, we were speaking with Tayside Procurement Consortium just yesterday, and we were asking about the question and answer approach, and they've got a really nice approach now. So you will get messages sent out which say here are our questions and answers. But the good news is when you click on that, it's going to be all of the question and answer that have come through. So you don't need to type your way back down the previous one. Whatever the latest one is, will have all the feedback from everyone up to that point. So at the moment, rather than individual answers logged from individual bidders, you've got it as a summary, which I think to me is really nice. I think that's a much nicer way to use it. So that's the received messages. Sent messages, I've not sent anything. Create is very straightforward. You just open it up and send through, and you can attach documents. You might be asked to do that later after the deadline. If you're asked for evidence, for example, you'll get a message here and you might have to reply with some policies or insurance documents, that kind of thing. So if we go back to ITT details, the settings will give you the latest deadline, if that's changing. They used to show that at the top. For some reason, they've changed it, which again is a wee bit annoying. But the settings here will give you that, plus the deadline for questions. This is the important part, so the buyer attachments. So I showed you that on the slides. There's a mass download up here, and that's what you would do if you're only just coming in to have a look at the documents. Check that. And you can check the modification date, because occasionally you do see some things that have been updated, and you'll get that through the messages as well. But literally all you're doing then is clicking on that. It'll open up these, and you can individually either download these, open them up, save them. To be honest, I tend to do the mass download, and then I kind of know I've got everything. And then here, you need to return up to the top level to get your full list again. So buyer attachments, definitely the first port of call if you haven't done that. And then my response is where we'll start to see the actual documents themselves. So we've got 3 areas: the qualification, I've mentioned to you before. Now, if you've already used public PCS tender to bid for anything, a lot of these answers will be filled in from the previous time. So that's quite useful. So I'm just going to increase this a little bit. But you do need to make sure that there's not something sitting there as an attachment, for example, that refers to a previous tender or maybe an insurance document that's out of date. So here on this particular tender, there's a section at the beginning called acceptance of documentation. This is really important because you've got to obviously click that you've understood. The supplier response guide is just the standard, choose PCST, but these ones here, conditions of contract, yes or no. So there's no yes, no, maybe. Have you understood the additional ones? Yes, no. So you'll really be held to that. So any questions you've got about those conditions of contract, you really need to get out of the way beforehand, because otherwise you've got no choice other than tick the box there. Crucial, tender offer, you must download, sign and upload, and there's the little icon that will let you download the document. Certificate of non-collusion, again, must go in. Yes, no, have you understood all the instructions and so on. Then you go into the SPD document. So this is a bit more straightforward. Let's try and slowly move down. So you can see the format here for anyone that's not used it. Lots of text, instructions. What you're looking for is anything here that's got the asterisk or a kind of response box to fill in. So you can see here it's filled in because we've used this system before. So this first section is all about very basic information on your business, name, address, so on, your legal status. There's questions about the size of your organisation. Are you supported business? I suspect in this sector probably nobody, because that's where you've got 30% or more disabled or disadvantaged in your employees. There's a strange question which kind of refers back to this European basis of this document. So there's a standard not applicable here. Section 2, so this is the important one where the first question is, are you a consortium? Possibly, I suspect nobody will be. It's more likely that you're further down, that you're more dealing with maybe a subcontract, lead subcontractor. Here, you can indicate which lots you want. So you can either select all of them or just one or two. And they'll add in there. You can delete them if you make a mistake. Representative of the bidder tends to be the senior director. Again, it's a wee bit of duplication to fill in that. Sorry, I'm just going slightly further up to, yeah, so this is your capacity on other entities. So really, you need to check what the selection criteria are, but it tends to be, and this certainly what I've seen is it's meeting financial criteria. So unless you need another organisation to help you meet those, or meet the the project examples, for example, if you're using another company's project examples in your supply chain, you would say yes to that, and then they would say, well, if that's the case, then you need to include an SPD, and it is a reduced one. It's really just the first parts. Do you intend to subcontract? So if you say yes, here's the list of the proposed. As far as known, this is quite a common question. If you don't know your subcontractors, you may not be able to add them here. But if you rely on them, so to speak, I would certainly be looking to add the list there. And then further down here is the SPD that you can download here, which is the reduced one, I would say. And you would attach the file, again, a zip file, if you've got more than one subcontractor in what you're proposing. Part 3 is what I would call these yes/no legal questions. So in general, everything is a no, and there's a couple of yes hidden in the middle, which is to do with paying tax, paying social security. But otherwise, generally, all of these have to be a no, otherwise you'll not be taken forward. There's one of the tax ones there. And then there's a few at the end which might not automatically fill in. So you can see, if you've not done this before, this part of the form looks really quite daunting, but in fact, because it's quite tick the box, it shouldn't take too long to go through. So these ones you'll have to fill in each time. Then we get on to the part 4. So this is much more the pass-fail part that is in that evaluation document. Professional register, they're looking for Companies House. You can add the link there if you've got one. The financial ratios, you've got to add here all that list that I showed you earlier, and I think it's just provided below as well, of the different ratios and what your results are. There's insurance limits, so either you already have it or you could say no but I commit. That's absolutely fine. And then, so here's the current ratios. So you'll have to fill in the values in that box above. And there's a little box down here, which is always a bit odd, concerning any other financial requirements. I would just, again, confirm your results in that box here, because it's got an asterisk. So if you don't fill it in, it's not going to let you submit your tender. 4C1, so that's where you're going to look at your examples of works. It says here the past 5 years, but I had a feeling that it was the past 3 years in one of the tender documents. We need to just check that. And you need 2 examples for each lot. So potentially that file could have a 16 times 2 projects if you were going for all the lots. And you have to attach it as a single file. Manpower, so the last 3 years, they're just looking for the total manpower. And then the second part of the question is, of that total, how many are managerial? It's, I don't know, depending on what sector you're in, managerial, I would definitely be including not just the senior management necessarily, but maybe some of the team senior kind of site managers, contract manager type. So yeah, it's just to get a feel, I guess, here for your capacity at this point in terms of the size of the organisation. But again, note it's a pass-fail, so you also need to be comfortable that you're putting in a good representation. The proportion, and I've made a note here, I would say what proportion and divide it by lots, because some lots you might not subcontract at all. And then 4D, the only thing is a standard question, and just kind of avoid this or ignore this text. This is standard from the European document that came in. All they want to know is at this point, yes, if you've got ISO 45001 or you've got JAS construction line, something from SSIP. If you don't, you would say no. And then there's a bit further down where you'd say, well, what do you have? Just move this forward. Now that's interesting. Maybe just check that, because normally if you say no, it allows you, I'm just going to see if it changes here. It would allow you then to add in some text in a text box as to what you do have, and you'd probably have to supply that later on. So I'm going to save and exit qualification. I don't think you'll have too many difficulties with that, but as I say, financial ratios and project examples, I would definitely highlight. Technical response, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just to remind you, so this is the format. Technical 1, please complete and reload. If you click on, now interestingly, that's turned into a little paperclip icon. I don't know if you can see that on my screen now, but it comes up with the document downloaded, so I can quite quickly open that up. Fill it in, obviously save it. So again, when you're submitting, make sure that you keep your files all well organized, drafts, and keep the upload folder completely separate only for your final versions. So technical 1, 2, you can see the follow all the same. So there's that little different icon, but they all give you the details as needed. So this is quite a big piece of work, I would say. Some of these is lot 1 to 9, for example, so it might not apply to the others. I think there's others further down that are slightly different. Here's sample reports, but only for lot 13. So I think the sooner you know the lots that you're going for, the better you'll be organised to go through this. Just to highlight as well, I think you'll all be familiar with what I would call the more standard technical questions. Be aware things like community benefits is scored at 2.5%. So you need to be make sure that that's adequately covered as well. It's quite easy for people to score really well on their technical responses, but community benefits, fair working practice, all these areas. And again, there's plenty guidance in the document, so there's really no excuse to put in a poor response in this area, but it might take a little bit of working around. There might be others in your organisation that you need to speak to who are more used to doing the training, work placements, people who handle the environmental side, living wage and all of that. Climate change, really important. Again here too, I can't see a score against that, so that might be an information only one. But again, your evaluation would tell you that. Okay, so the technical, in a sense, it looks quite nice and clean in the form, but there's a lot of work involved to make sure that those are meeting all the requirements. Save and exit. Oops. I'll just go on to the commercial response. Sometimes I have these boxes saying a total price, but I don't think the way it's set up, that's never really going to be filled in, because all you're doing is attaching files here, not filling in any boxes. So 311, this is the pricing schedule, and this is the one that has to be filled in. Obviously, all the lots, it will tell you in the specification document which elements of the Excel sheet that you need to fill in. I think I've had a quick look at it, and it looks like sort of organised a little bit like a bill of quantities with different sort of reference numbers. So they've got a pricing review, and the price score is basically, it's going to be the one that incorporates payment of the living wage. So this 311 document here. Let me just have a look. So there's a note there about the updated pricing schedule. So just to let you know, anyone that's been updated as of 2nd of June. So make sure that you're using the latest one. Payment of the living wage. You need to confirm that your rates above allow for that. So that's just a yes, no. And this is where you can put in, but it is mandatory. If you notice, there's that little asterisk there, and there's the link to the spreadsheet. That Excel file is if you do not currently pay the living wage. I suppose, again, I would ask a question there. So if I do pay the living wage, I guess I would just upload the same file here, because if I don't upload anything, that's not going to let me submit the question at the end. There's an element on to-pay, but I guess because it's a framework, obviously the buying authority won't commit to whether it does or does not apply, but I think normally we just need to say, yes, we've bid, knowing whether to-pay applies, or just say no, we're bidding, assuming there's no to-pay applied to take on any existing teams. So I'm not going to go into the pricing spreadsheets, obviously, in any great detail, because that's your area of expertise. But in terms of the response, that then is the 3 elements that you need to cover. So at any time, obviously, you're checking your messages, you're filling in. Be aware if you've got 2 or 3 people using the same password, if you're both working on the documents, either it'll block you, or there might be a danger that somebody overwrites something and what you thought you'd saved hasn't saved. So I would set up an associated user, or just manage, if you like, the content coming in. That's the 3 dots, so the printable view. You can just you can download as a PDF, but you can see from that it just gives you the whole questionnaire. So quite long, but you can, once you've completed it, it gives you all the information. And submitting, click OK. So I'll click OK, but it'll obviously come back and tell me there's lots of stuff that's 27 errors. Okay, so that's telling me here's all the bits that have these asterisk stars against them that I've not filled in. Okay, so I think, Fran, that's everything from our side, but I don't know if there's any questions.